drawn-out process. I'm glad that today is Wednesday and tomorrow will be the surgery day, so I apologize again for my absence. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into Chapter 2, where we're looking at the integrative approach to psychology. So what are we going to look at here? We're going to look at unidimensional and multidimensional models of psychopathology. We're going to look at how genes interact with the environment. We're going to look at the different brain regions, neurotransmitters, and how all that influences abnormal behavior. And then we're going to look at how all of those particular behavioral, emotional, cognitive sciences influence the explanation and cultural factors that affect psychopathology. All right, so whenever we talk about a one-dimensional model, you can pretty much guess what this means. It means that we're looking at one single cause in our explanation of abnormality. This can be a school of thought, it can be a conceptual idea or approach. But what it does, and that's the critical to remember, is that it really tends to ignore information from other areas. So it gives that example of obsessive compulsive being attributed to just simply family history there. But then there's the multidimensional approach, which is a collective and integrative and interdisciplinary. In other words, we begin to say that abnormality is not due to one cause, it's due to a system of influences that not only cause the psychopathology, but maintain the psychopathology. So we look at several sources and look at several influences there. So what would those influences be? They'd be biological, behavioral, emotional, sociocultural, developmental, and environmental. And so here's a schematic that essentially shows you an example of how all those particular influences play and integrate together to produce a blood injection injury phobia. So, and you can see they're quite interrelated and they can go off in many different directions as to causality and then response. But the most important thing to remember from that schematic is that it's an integrative model, and there are multi-sources as to that particular phobia there. So as we break down our biological influence, our genetic influence, we begin to look at the differences between phenotypes and genotypes. One is presentation and one is what you've inherited. Okay, so nature of your genes, your DNA. DNA represents that double helix. There are 23 pair of chromosomes, obviously. There's dominant recessive genes that can contribute to development of abnormality. And there is polygenetic. In other words, we can have multiple genetic tracers or contributors to the development of psychopathology across multiple generations of families, etc. Genetic contribution to psychopathology. At this time, technology is showing us, research is showing us that it really plays about a less than 50% role in terms of creating psychopathology. So that really kind of tells you the role of the environment, role of social, psychological, etc. All right, so here's a picture of our normal versus or our normal chromosomes. This is from a normal female. Okay, and then as we back up, I should have backed up a little bit more. So some normal chromosomes going on as to what it should look like. There's 23 chromosomes there. Okay. But at any point in time that we have a deterioration of those chromosomes, obviously that's when we begin to say there's something going on genetically here through the DNA that's causing that abnormality. All right, so when we look at Eric Kandel, he is one of the very first persons to talk about the gene-environment interaction. He says that your genes actually change as a product of your experience, of your learning experience. So, for example, an inactive gene can actually all of a sudden become active as a product of environmental influences. This leads us to talk about this diathesis stress model. And what the diathesis stress model is simply a pre-existing vulnerability that has not been manifested yet, has not risen up to show itself as a product of the environment. My best story about a diathesis stress model is that I worked with a kid that was just horribly comorbid in terms of diagnosis, had major depression, OCD, looked like symptoms of schizophrenia, and there was just a revolving door in terms of that symptoms. A little bit about the history is that this child had been an All-American track star soccer player recruited by Ivy League schools throughout the United States. Great kid, great family, well-to-do family, lots of resources. Dad was heavily invested in her life and her soccer career. So they won a championship. They were at the lake. Dad is skiing behind the ski boat, drops dead of an aneurysm, Whole team witnesses this. Later, this particular child begins to hear Dad's voice through the television, begins to dream and see him, reappearing in dreams. That's not unusual. None of that is unusual for grief. But later, as time progresses, she becomes a little bit more obsessive compulsive, a lot more anxious, withdrawn, isolative, goes into the bathroom at school, hides under the sink, fights people if they try to move her from one place to the next. Eventually has to be removed from school because her behavior is so bizarre, so much like hallucinations, delusions, obsessive compulsive about things not feeling right and not being willing to be moved until they do feel right. So there's lots of that environmental stress going on as the product of Dad's death. However, one of the more interesting things about this client is that she was a carrier of strep throat. And at that time that I was treating her, the NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, had made this discovery that strep throat is directly correlated to obsessive compulsive behavior in children. Now, this kid was meticulous in terms of how she took care of her equipment, her sporting equipment. She was meticulous about how she did her homework, how she kept her room, etc. So was Dad, quite honestly. So the question would have been, was there a little bit of obsessive compulsive going on there that may be related to the strep? And she certainly was showing that OCD after the death of her father, because she was just very absorbed with and just consumed with things feeling just right before she would move from point A to point B, even in our residential treatment center. So lots of obsessive compulsive behavior, lots of kind of dishevelment, physically looking like a schizophrenic, and then obviously, trauma. We have to say, what's the role of trauma here? So she was a revolving door of comorbidity, but one would have to ask, in the diathesis stress model, what was the pre-existing vulnerability? Was it obsessive compulsive disorder? Was there maybe something else? Was there maybe the relationship? Maybe there's one of our psychologists wondered if there was not sexual abuse between the father and the daughter because they were so incredibly close. So we didn't really know, but I certainly think that as an example of pre-existing vulnerability, one would have to say that obsessive compulsive strep carrying gene that she had, that is quite an interesting trigger. She wound up going to a treatment program. There was a group home for obsessive compulsive disorder. However, she got aggressive and was eventually kicked out. And I do not know to this day what happened with the kid. All right, so this is another schematic that's going to show you the relationship between environment and genetics. I'll let you look at that with regards to alcohol consumption. So in this particular schematic, what we're seeing here is that if this person is actually having major depressive episodes, we look at what happens with them with no treatment, with no maltreatment, kids that or a person that has had maltreatment, and then severe maltreatment. And so what do we then begin to see? We begin to see a change in their alleles, okay, which is part of their cellular structure. Okay. So proof that abuse and trauma can actually begin to change us at the cellular level. What's that reciprocal gene environment model? Again, going back and saying which one has the greatest effect, the environment or the genetics? So this particular model says that, again, we're back to the discussion of pre-existing genetic vulnerabilities and experience. Okay. Epigenetics and non-genomic inheritance of behavior. Genes are not necessarily the whole story. Can be environmental influences. Again, we're talking about diathesis stress, we're talking about reciprocal gene environment model, and we're talking about epigenetics there. So in other words, these are all the efforts to show that we really can't prove that biology is the end-all be-all in terms of causal factors behind psychopathology. Now, neuroscience is really giving us a greater insight into what's going on in the brain with those individuals that experience psychopathology, not so much at the blood and cellular level now, but at the brain level. So we begin to, in neuroscience, look at the role of the nervous system in the disease and behavior. So what I mean by nervous system, I mean brain, spinal cord, peripheral nervous system, right? Okay. So in that peripheral nervous system, you do remember the somatic and autonomic branches. So here's our breakdown of that. And you remember the peripheral nervous system are those like hair-like fibers that are running up all parts of your body into the spine, between the disc in your spine, or the vertebrae in your spine, cushioned by that disc, sending that message up through the spinal cord into the brain and the brain structures, as we have them outlined here. And then some type of that sensory information going up, and then motor information coming down there as to what to do, how to act, etc. All right, so when we look at the pons, the medulla, the cerebellum, we know that pons is responsible for pain and emotions. Medulla is responsible for basically your respiration, your breathing, your blood pressure, etc. Cerebellum is going to be also responsible for those life-sustaining activities. These are the parts of the brain that are really kind of connecting the spinal cord to the upper part of the brain. And then the thalamus, hypothalamus, and pituitary gland. Pituitary gland obviously is one of those part of the endocrine system that's responsible for growth, metabolism, sexual development, etc. And the hypothalamus is that core area that is really responsible for sex, food, thirst, body temperature, and on. So we won't go all the way through those. Let's jump down to somatic. That somatic part of the brain is going to, or the nervous system is going to control the voluntary movements, really kind of convey that sensory information. Autonomic then is going to really control involuntary kind of movements. It's going to, sympathetic is going to expend energy, whereas parasympathetic is going to conserve energy. So that's your arousal system. Breaking down the neurons, which are the chemical, which are the message highways in our brain. We know that the soma is the cell body. Dendrites are the branches that receive that message. Axon is the trunk of the neuron that sends the message. Axon terminals are the buds at the end of the axon where those messages are sent. And the synapse is that gap between the two separate neurons that those neurotransmitters are going to jump. We know that neurons operate electrically, but communicate chemically. Okay, so the neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers. We know that we have a positive and negative distribution of ions inside, outside of the neuron. We know that when we're talking about depolarization, hyperpolarization, and polarization, then we're really kind of getting into the discussion of action potential and resting potential. And it is our neurotransmitters that are responsible for sending that message of excitation of the action potential or inhibition of and into resting potential. So as we look at that neurotransmitter, let's start with it. So we have a synthesis of neurotransmitter and formation of vesicles. We transport those neurotransmitters down the axon. That transportation is protected by the myelin sheath. They then are released of the neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap. There, the neurotransmitter is going to interact with that enzyme in that synaptic gap. Those that are appropriately designated for excitatory and inhibitory information are going to plug into that postsynaptic neuron. And those that are not designated for that excitation and or inhibition then are going to be degraded by the enzyme that's in the synaptic gap and then go through the process of being reabsorbed or reuptake into that neurotransmitter to be recycled. Okay. All right, so going into the brain structure, brain stems contains the hindbrain, midbrain, thalamus, hypothalamus. And that hypothalamus is the thing that connects brainstem and forebrain. Forebrain is your limbic system. Basal ganglia, cerebral cortex. All right, so we covered the thalamus, hypothalamus. Let's talk about the forebrain. Limbic system is responsible for emotion, basal ganglia, movement, memory, awareness of like reality there, good mental health, the place where we really have a high production of dopamine. Dopamine is that feel good, so obviously the basal ganglia is going to be really involved in that reward system kind of experience. Cerebral cortex, largest part of the brain, and it's the wrinkled structure of the brain comprised of those gyra and sulci. When spread out, it's about the size of a newspaper. And it's in the cerebral cortex that we have all of those motor cortex, somatosensory cortex, etc., and all the subcortical parts of the brain are running into the cortical all the way up to the cerebral cortex. to transfer that information, of course, from the peripheral nervous system up to the spinal cord into the brain and thereby response. So the hindbrain, really responsible for regulating that automatic processes. We mentioned the medulla is the heart rate, blood pressure, respiration. Pons really regulates sleep and pain. Cerebellum really involved in physical coordination, balance. This is the place where if you drink alcohol, that you're going to get an immediate impact and thereby causing the potential for imbalance. Midbrain then is going to coordinate the movement from that sensory input that's coming up out of that peripheral nervous system. It's going to contain parts of that reticular activating system. And that limbic system is going to help regulate that emotional experience and expression, our ability to learn, control impulses. And here we're going to find that hippocampus, the cingulate, the septum, and the amygdala. That forebrain really is primarily mostly sensory and emotional cognitive processing. Cerebral cortex, as you know, has two hemispheres, has four lobes, frontal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe, and temporal lobe. Hemisphere is connected by the cerebral, I just went blank, corpus callosum. So the hemispheres are connected by the corpus callosum, and that then allows the hemispheres to essentially talk to one another. And as you know, in some situations, we have to sever that corpus callosum because of the information being exchanged is all about having, this person's having maybe some really horrible seizure-related kind of activity. All right, so in the lobes, the frontal lobe, thinking, reasoning, memory. Parietal, touch recognition. Occipital, vision. Temporal, recognition of sight, sounds. Long-term memory, understanding language. Okay. So obviously, when we think about damage to any of those lobes, obviously if we pick the occipital lobe, damage to the occipital lobe is going to lead to blindness, inability to recognize stimulus. Temporal lobe, really responsible for sights and sounds, really understanding long-term memory. And then touch recognition is going to be parietal, is kind of involved with, do you know where you're at in kind of time and space? And touch, do you recognize what you see and touch, stimulus-wise? And then frontal lobe damage there is going to have a lot to do with inhibition, the ability to defer long and short-term memory. Okay, let's see how much of this do we want to go over. Bear with me for a moment. I'm going to put you on pause for just 2 seconds here.